Hello, welcome to my video on how I made my metal star with crystals and fairy lights. Now this project took a lot of time. I started out with some star frames that I bought on Amazon. They came in a variety of sizes. Taking two of them, I cut one of them at its weld so that I could nest the two together and make a three-dimensional star. Now the one I'm going to be showing you that I soldered is the bigger frame, but I'm using this one as an example of how I put them together. So first of all, I had to foil the star frame itself so that solder would stick to it. Now there's two different ways you can foil it. I'm using 7/32 inch foil, and you can either wrap it around like I'm showing you right now, and I'm using inexpensive foil that's copper backed. Usually I use black backed foil, but this is just to make it so that the metal frame will accept solder. So you can wrap it around like that, and of course even when you wrap it, you need to make it really smooth and stick by pushing it and rubbing the foil smooth into the frame. Or you can do this method, which is a little bit faster, but unless you're going to attach a lot of stuff to it, it tends to pick up a lot more when you're soldering because it's such a long seam. But this is a quick way to do it. What I did was lay one piece kind of in the middle and bent it around, and then got out a second piece and did it on the other side. And this was a pretty quick way of making it covered in copper foil. Again, you need to make sure that it's all pressed down real well and smoothed out. I usually use a plastic probe that I also bought on Amazon. I buy a lot of stuff on Amazon because you can look at a lot of different vendors, and if you have Prime, it's free shipping. So, and it's pretty quick. So that's what I use for a lot of my supplies. So as you see, I smoothed it all down so it was really smooth. Now after you have your two stars all foiled nicely, I put them together using wire, copper wire, bare copper wire. Usually use around 22 gauge or 20 gauge. Depends on what you have handy. What you want is something that's pretty strong to just hold it sturdy. The bottom, of course, was one of the hardest parts to convince to stay together. I was kind of wrapped one side for a while, then I would wrap the other side until it stayed steady. One thing about wires, if you coil them around in a circle, you can then tighten them by just using needle nose pliers, and that kind of makes your project the way you want it. After the frame itself is connected, I then decided I needed to fill in the flat part of the star with some kind of wire armature to hold it together and provide surfaces to attach my wires and crystals to. And this was my final one that I end up soldering and demonstrating later on. So obviously you can either use up all your wire that you started off with or just cut off the excess. So I decided I'd go from the point of one of the parts of the star to between the points on the other side. And I just went all the way around my star doing the same pattern. Yeah, what I'm doing there is I don't want the end of the wire to be sticking out because while I'm working, it would poke me and I'd end up getting poked lots of times. So every time I do a wire, I try to make sure that the end of it is kind of in the inside and squished down. Now, before you go any further, if your star is not symmetrical, you can adjust your wires. This is the time to do it because the more wires you put on, the harder it's going to be to change the shape. After you've gotten the basic shape, you can start doing longer pieces at a time. So now I'm doing 2 different points of the star at once. You can just keep going and going until you feel you've gotten the shape you want. So this is about what the armature looked like for my big star that I am going to continue showing. I used a variety of different shapes. These are brass or copper. These are actually copper washers. And these right here are glass beads. I don't use any resins because resins will not like being heated up with a solder iron. To thread them all together, I use a pretty thin wire, like I use here is a 26 gauge. I also bought these fun gears. They're metal. They're different colored metal, different alloys, inexpensive shapes on Amazon. A lot of different shapes, which were fun to make my star. And I basically used like sewing techniques with the wire to attach the different pieces all along. What I'm planning on doing at this point is leaving spaces where I can put crystals. So I'm going to show you how I attach different wires, different shapes. Yeah, this took a number of hours, a lot of hours to thread these all on. I avoided overlapping the shapes for the most part, but there are times when they did end up overlapping. I usually wrap them around 3 times, sometimes only 2, to make sure everything is really sturdy. Again, I squished the end down and the little loops down so they laid pretty flat. Yeah, the hard part is figuring out what to put where. To maintain the star shape, I tried to make like a little ridge along each star where I had that wires that I put in. So the shapes usually only go halfway, and they kind of try to keep them going up at an angle. So there's some three-dimensionality to this. Right now I'm kind of looping the little gear on with a bead before I actually start attaching it to the wire frame. Yeah, the more parts I put on, the harder it was to get my fingers inside of the unit to get the wires. That's okay. And if there was a space nearby, I wouldn't cut the excess wire off. I would wait till I put that part in and then use that wire for attaching the next piece. So at this point, there are some extra wires just kind of sticking out, ready to be used later. Yeah, these videos are shown at 4 times, sometimes 8 times um, the normal speed so that it's not too boring to watch. But you can slow it down on your own if you want to. Right now I'm attaching a piece of actual brass, bare brass wire that I have. That was about 22 gauge. So a lot of the little curlicue designs are like little swirls of wire with or without beads to help add interest and take up space. I also took some of the wires and made little heart shapes and diamond shapes and other different shapes that I also added to different parts of the star. As I mentioned earlier, this did take hours and hours to do. And I'm not going to show you all of this sewing. See, right here is one of the brass wire configurations. Some of these are actually scraps from other projects that I was going to use them, and then I ended up not using these pieces. So it's a great way to use up little pieces of wires that you happen to have. This is what my project looked like after I had added all the gears and wires. So now it's ready to be soldered. I'm using a gel flux and sometimes a liquid flux that I put in a little spray bottle. But the gel flux I like the most. I'm using scraps of solder, 40-60 tin lid solder. I was at one point thinking that I would just leave it. It was really colorful. Just leave it the way it was and put my twinkle lights in, but I really wanted to add the crystals. So, and in order to hold the crystals, I'd have to solder the crystals on. So I decided I would just cover the whole project with solder. And it's a good way to use up any scrap solder I have. Some of the different gears took solder better than others. The washers, the one that I'm doing right now, that big round washer, is bare copper, so it takes solder really great. Yeah, this part of the project took a few hours also, because there really are a lot of surfaces to coat. I turned my iron up quite high, actually, close to 500, so that on some of the gears where it didn't really want to stick, it would almost be like I would be cooking off whatever paint or whatever was on the gears. You can see that I'm picking up with my tweezers globs of old solder and using that. So yeah, you don't want to throw away any of your scraps of solder, because there's always some place you can use them. You can also use new solder if that's what you have. It's kind of hard to get the wires that are underneath the beads tinned. Now, of course, I'm not going to show you all of it, but you get the idea. You just cover the whole project with solder. And even when it was finished, it's a little hard to see, but there are some of the gears did not take solder very well. So what I decided I would do, I would coat them with metallic paint. They make this paint that is activated, has metal actually in it, and this is what I was using. And so I painted lots and lots of gears. As you can see, I painted a lot of the gears that were not taking solder. And then I went over again and tried to add solder to all those as I was putting in the crystals. Now I decided for this star, I'm going to limit myself to just yellow and clear and those AB clear-ish. They kind of do like rainbow looking crystals. So these are glass crystals that I bought. I bought a lot of them at AliExpress that were foiled on the back. They had like that mirror image on the back, and I had to strip them. And I do have um, a YouTube video showing how to use different removers to get the coating off the back. That's called a foiled coating. And then I would wrap the crystals with usually a quarter width or a fifth width of the 7/32 inch black backed foil, so that these little crystals have a ring of foil around them, so I have something to solder. And I do have YouTube videos showing how to foil crystals. As you can see, I'm like tacking the circle in place. And then I'm going to go all the way around it wherever I can. If there's little gaps where the crystal isn't actually touching the surface, that's okay. As long as it's mainly soldered on, it's not going to go anywhere. One thing that will happen when you solder crystals on is if you heat up, especially if you heat them up too much, the foil will actually unstick from the crystal, and the crystal might just fall out. Because the crystals are glass, so they're kind of heavy. So as you see, I'm going all the way around the crystal so it's nice and soldered on. I actually bought some really small clear crystals. They're 6 millimeter in diameter. I usually only go down to 10 millimeters, but I bought some that were 6 millimeters that I'm using for this project for the really small circles. Yeah, that yellow thing that's in the picture all the time is the end of my venting system. One thing I like about the gel flux is that it doesn't seem to smoke up as much as the liquid stuff I have tried. But you still need good ventilation. Here I'm trying to put a small crystal, which looks great right there. But when I try to solder it on, it kind of just like falls in the hole. Whoops. And so it's just this crystal's just a little bit too small for the space. So what I'm doing is adding an extra wire across that opening so that I can attach my crystal. Because I tried a big one right there, and it was just too big. I wanted that smaller size. So I took a wire and just soldered it on one end, then soldered my crystal down. And then I just cut off the extra part of the wire and soldered over that little knob that stuck out so that it looked okay. Now this is one of those really little clear 6 millimeter crystals that I talked about. So I put flux down and it kind of held it in place while I was soldering, but I still used my tweezers. I kind of flooded one side to tack it down and then just went around on each spoke of that little gear. So wherever there was this area that had a small little circle, I added one of my tiny crystals. So most of the crystals in this project are the 6 millimeter, the 10 millimeter, the 18 millimeter, and then I have some larger variety of like 25 or 30 millimeters, but most of them are the three smaller sizes. You can also use the stick of solder actually to help hold your project temporarily. So I continued adding solder wherever the copper was still showing, and also adding crystals wherever there was a space that needed a crystal. Those orange washers there are silicone washers that I use to balance and hold usually crystals at times. And I'm working on a silicone blue mat. Sometimes it's hard to get those little crystals to lay the way I want. I like to have the flat part going down. Sometimes they're just kind of stubborn. I decided I didn't like that particular crystal. It's a little bit pinkish and it just didn't go with the rest of them. So I had to keep on adding flux and heat to try to pop it off. And then once I got it off, I used tweezers to hold the foil and got all the foil off. And then I put another crystal there that was clearer. So if you don't like what you're doing, you can just remove it and start over. This is my project when I was done with the crystals and the soldering, and I am spraying it with, actually first I sprayed it with some copper patina, and then I sprayed it with some black patina, and then scrubbed the black patina in. So there's some areas that are a little coppery colored, and most of it is black on the solder. But once I added the lights, because the wire of the lights is copper colored, it's okay to have some of that copper color as part of the project. And I let it sit for a little while, and then I rinse it off. So this is what it looks like before I added the lights. And you can see there are some copper hunks showing still. Now I bought a strand of 300 fairy lights. Probably if I did it that actually plug in just to your regular electricity. If I was going to do it again, I probably would have used less fairy lights, because this again took hours to get these fairy lights inside my star. Now I did leave one circle without a crystal as my area to put the fairy lights into. So with using probes and tweezers, and I actually even used a crochet hook at times, I slowly, meticulously shoved wire through that opening for a few hours until I could get all of the fairy lights inside my star and have them also up to the corners and points of each star. No, I'm not going to actually show you all this because it was kind of hard to see exactly what I was doing. But basically, I just kept on feeding in more and trying to convince the wires to bend and go into all the corners. Most of the time I did it with the lights on so I could tell if I killed it completely and the wires broke, at least I wouldn't finish the whole project and then find out it didn't light. As you can see, it lit beautifully, just like I wanted it to. And these fairy lights that I bought came with a controller, so you can change how you want your lights to look. You know, they can sparkle or flash or whatever. And it's a lot of fun. I plan on hanging this up in the air, and it'll just be a festive star. Of course, you can see the loop at the top on the left-hand side there where my hand is. That's where I am going to hang it. And I put that loop in at the beginning of the project. And you can see the little heart by my hand there. Yeah, there's a lot of different shapes going on. It's a time-consuming yet lots of fun project, and I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed making it.